Good evening and welcome to Perspective. Tonight we explore a shifting geopolitical moment for South Asia, one defined by stark contrasts, whether we look at leadership, diplomacy or moral authority. On one side, Pakistan's Prime Minister Mohammad Shehbaz Sharif is being redefined because of his domestic administrative role, and also that is growing to be a statesman with international weight. We'll be talking about his strategic diplomacy. When we talk about Washington or Riyadh, when we talk about Beijing or Ankara, and the fact that Pakistan is being seen as a stabilizing force under his leadership in an increasingly polarized world. In contrast, we talk about what's happening across the border as far as Narendra Modi is concerned, who's facing a huge backlash, whether we talk about the question of recognition of Palestine as a state, the kind of criticism that is being resounding all over for his leadership, for his decisions there. And later on, of course, we've seen what's happening, the deadly crackdown in Ladakh at this time, where demands for statehood is ending in bloodshed even as we speak, and there are questions being asked about India's moral compass. Moving on, we'll be talking about, of course, what is Shehbaz Doctrine, what is being called Shehbaz Doctrine, which is a mix of diplomacy, discipline and delivery reshaping Pakistan's foreign policy. Then we move on to India's silence on Gaza and, of course, Sonia Gandhi's scathing comments when she calls it a complete abdication of humanity. And then we move on to the unrest in Ladakh as 4 civilians were killed and dozens arrested in a peaceful protest for what was only statehood. We have with us today Juauhar Saleem, who is a former Foreign Secretary. Thank you for being with us today. We'll also be joined by other guests during the course of the program. Munir Akram, who is former Permanent Rep from Pakistan to the UN, and Brigadier Retired Waqar Khan. Juauhar Sahab, we know what's been happening as far as diplomacy is concerned for a while now. If we look at the Prime Minister, if we look at, like I said, if we look at what's happened in Riyadh, if we look at what's happened in, of course, Turkey also, we look at what's happened in Beijing also. Overall, diplomacy, as far as Pakistan is concerned, has taken center stage. How are you looking at the evolution of what has happened, in a very short span of time, putting Pakistan center stage? We also saw the UNGA yesterday. We also saw the way the Prime Minister spoke yesterday, the way he took on key issues, right, very aptly, very quickly, and spoke about those things that really are, the reasons for us, standing in front of the UNGA. He talked about climate change, he talked about what's happened in India, he talked about terrorism that is constantly being perpetrated from across the border, whether we look at Afghanistan and of course Palestine. So how are you looking at, among other things, so how are you looking at the way that it's resonating, that diplomacy in the world?
I think you put it very aptly. While stating that Pakistan's diplomatic profile has really risen in the last few months in particular, I think we're in a real good place right now in terms of our diplomatic profile, our strategic profile, in terms of how the world is looking at Pakistan as a responsible state, as a stabilizing factor, as a net security provider, not just in its own region, but beyond. And the great thing is that, like one of the defining challenges that we had for our foreign policy, which was how to sort of calibrate relations between Pakistan and China on the one hand, and between Pakistan and the US on the other, given the sort of, the increasing rivalry between the two countries in a world which was sort of, which is getting in some ways, which is witnessing some sort of an emerging bipolarization again. So I think we have been able to very adequately address that challenge. Right now, of course, our relations with China, they have been sort of, always special, exemplary. It's an all-weather strategic cooperative partnership. Our biggest
for a while,
yeah.
I'm going to interject, for a while there was a lot of talk about Pakistan balancing. First, of course, it started from across the border with isolation. the propaganda that ensued. And then it became about whether Pakistan can balance things or not. And now when we look at the way things have happened over time, of course, we look at the Prime Minister's transformation from a crisis manager to a respected statesman. We look at, of course, the US relations at this time, again China, again what's happened as far as Ankara is concerned, Saudi Arabia more recently also.
Yeah.
So that is a stark contrast.
Exactly. You see, because and that's why I use the word calibrate rather than balance. Because I mean, of course, balance could be used, but sometimes like people get a sort of a mistaken notion that maybe with balance we mean that we are trying to equate the level of our relations with the US to that with China.
Yeah.
The nature of those relations is quite different in many ways. But both are very important in their own ways.
Yeah.
But the other factors that you've mentioned, after this conflict that happened between Pakistan and India, I think that has brought a sea change. And why is that? Because before that, India had been sort of involved in a nefarious propaganda against Pakistan, trying to portray Pakistan as an irresponsible state on the one hand, as a state which was using sort of terrorism as a tool of foreign policy. Malicious propaganda for which they had disinfo campaigns and for which they were using all their diplomatic weight, their economic weight, their strategic weight, and which was considerable because they are the biggest country in the world in terms of population. They tout themselves as the biggest democracy and all that. But what has happened since then is all that propaganda, that false portrayal has just fallen apart. And why is that? There are 3 or 4 reasons for that.
Okay.
Number one is in the name of strategic autonomy, India was actually practicing hypocrisy. They were practicing duplicity. They were practicing a Machiavellian philosophy, or rather, I should say, Chanakya's philosophy, where he says the deception should be used as a means for your ends. But that fell apart. Why? On the one hand, they were telling the Americans and the Western countries that, we will be the counterweight to China. We are the linchpin of your containment policy against China. And, we are your biggest strategic partner in the world. On the other hand, they were buying the Russian oil despite sanctions and selling it in the black markets in the world. On the third side, with Iran also, they were involved in trade which was not really looking, which the West was not looking at very pleasantly. And sort of, in a similar way, they were practicing duplicity in their relations with many countries within the region. What they were trying, they were trying to sort of, enhance their hegemonic sort of weight in the region. They create a strategic dominance, and there was a huge resistance to that from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, every country in the region. So remember those words when sort of, and the hubristic attitude that they had when Jaishankar said, oh, the era of uninterrupted dialogue is over. And the way he described other countries in the region in one particular speech was like all these countries were client states of India. From there, they have fallen to abject lows. Now there's a point where the relations with America, we know, they're literally sort of, every day there's a new challenge that they're facing. Why? Because President Trump has seen through their sort of duplicity. Whether it's the trade matters, whether it's sort of their flouting of sessions, whether it's they're taking away jobs from America, whether sort of, in terms of the defense deals, what they're doing, everything is now exposed. So that is why, and then the way Pakistan behaved very responsibly in a statesman, the statesmanship that Pakistan sort of, showed
when we talk
during
about
that crisis.
Statesmanship, we saw even yesterday when the Prime Minister made his address in the UNGA. In spite of everything, we've always maintained, in spite of showing the strength that we did post Pahalgam. And we kept on saying we want peace. And yesterday also he echoed that. He said that we want togetherness, we want peace, we want to move towards a world that does not divide. And that is the sign of a true statesman when we look at the way, and not just the crisis management that we saw happen in the war with India. This is what has followed that. Exactly.
People used to say the world over, the analysts used to say Pakistan has been involved in a perennial firefight, or crisis management, like you're saying. On the one hand, we were facing this, which we still face, by the way. We are confronted by this immense challenge of terrorism emanating from Afghanistan and from India, and on the other hand, economic challenges that we were facing, and then sort of, this defense challenge that India posed to Pakistan. But what we have, like how we have addressed those challenges in recent times.
And they started with saying that, put Pakistan on FATF.
Yeah.
That's where it started from.
Exactly,
and
not
that,
just
you're a
FATF.
terrorist country, it's a terrorist country. Where are they now? That is a question.
Every forum in the world, India was trying to malign us, everywhere in the world, not even in the SCO, for example. And their endeavors were defeated there. Everywhere. In FATF, they sort of, their nefarious plans have been finally neutralized. I think whether we talk about the United Nations or in the UN, they tried to sort of, stop us from becoming a non-permanent member of the UN, and we got the highest number of votes.
Yesterday? Yeah. Where was Modi yesterday? I think that, his absence, I think is itself, is self-explanatory when you look at the way. And where is the isolation that they said that Pakistan, was isolated? Pakistan is not being able to maintain relationships across the board at this time when we look at the Pakistan-Saudi Pact. Yeah. Just that. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. There are, like I said, the relationships with other countries are themselves an example of this diplomacy that is a consistent one that is at play. And we saw the COS also, and the Prime Minister and Field Marshal, meet President Donald Trump, the second time in the last 2 months?
Yeah.
So there is, a consistent kind of diplomacy and a kind of balancing act that I think is hard to find.
I think, exactly. I would say the way we are navigating that, the way we are calibrating our sort of diplomacy, it's right now, because you see, I think we have found the pulse of the times, know, and Pakistan is on the right track. And also, I think the biggest thing that we have done in the last 6 months, in my view, which has really put us on the right track, is that we have been able to expose India to the world, because India had been the biggest destabilizing force in this region, and they had been involved totally in trying to undermine Pakistan and at every forum in the world, and through every mechanism that they had, and through every bilateral relationship that they had in the world. And because of what has happened in recent months, the way they have been exposed as a country, and not just as a country, as a leadership. Because Modi, who's Modi? Modi is a fascist, he represents a fascist party, he represents a fascist ideology, and he represents a very nefarious type of hegemonic foreign policy.
Which brings us to what's happening within India. I want to talk about that. We've seen the kind of criticism, of course, that has ensued from their own leadership, whether we look at, of course, what was Sonia Gandhi, whether we look at what she said that, there's a profound silence on Israel's war in Gaza. When we look at what's happened there, she calls India's muted response a complete abdication of humanity and morality, which is what it is. She's calling out and, of course, urging India to return to traditional diplomatic values. We've seen what's happened. And of course, later on, we talk about Ladakh also, the way that it's sort of traveled there also. And then, we look at the rising of Hindutva. We look at the rising of extremism, which is what the Prime Minister again, said yesterday in UNGA, which is what Modi stands for. So how are things, in India in terms of, the fragmentation, the extremism? How are you looking at that situation?
It's not just India's foreign policy which is falling apart. India, domestically as well, is in a deep malaise now. And that has been the result of the very divisive, very hypocritical, very sort of, hate-mongering policies that were promoted by BJP, by RSS, and by Modi particularly. And, because you see, you can do that for some times. You can make a fool of people for some time, but you cannot do that forever. And in India, I think there's a growing recognition now that Modi has failed to deliver on his economic promises. Because you see, he touted himself as a messiah for India, who would develop India economically, who would put India on the world map as one of the preeminent powers, and sort of, and who has this 56-inch sort of, chest, and who would sort of, has the muscle to sort of, make India a kind of, like a real power rather than a paper tiger that it is actually. But I think all that propaganda is now sort of, totally exposed. Because we know the reality of India's economic development now.
Within India also, we also saw the speech that Rahul Gandhi earlier made in Parliament when he talked about the mistakes, the miscalculation that resulted in India, destroying itself during Pahalgam. And later, of course, he called Modi's government silence morally bankrupt and betrayal of India's tradition of human rights.
I would totally
endorse that. I don't know if there
was
a tradition of human rights, but at this time it seems to have completely eroded.
Moral bankruptcy is so evident from the fact that, on Gaza, like you said, I mean, what the whole world has spoken, whether it's South America, countries like Brazil, who even withdrew their ambassador from Israel, or whether it's Europe, who were like steadfast allies with the Israelis, how they have one after another they've been recognizing against Israel's wishes, whether it's countries like Japan, Australia, Central Asia, everywhere in the world. But one country which has been missing in action totally is India. Where is India? Which touts itself as the biggest democracy in the world, which touts itself as a guardian of sort of, like those moral values. India, on the one hand, it was nowhere to be seen. On the other, we saw during the Iran-Israel crisis, again, the conflict, India was nowhere to be seen. When the UN Charter was being violated, when the territorial integrity of a country was being violated, or the sovereignty of a country was being, India, which actually professed to be a great friend of Iran, and they're building Chabahar together, and sort of, and India was trying to build it as a counterweight to Gawada. India was again totally, totally disappeared.
The complete erosion of human rights, and of course it started with the media also. We saw how, the media had been completely influenced, and now even people like Barkhat Datta saying that Modi's silence is itself a glaring diplomatic failure, nothing less. Yes. And the question is, isn't it true? I mean, what more could be a failure than being synonymous with Netanyahu at this time, which is how Modi is being seen?
Let me tell you one thing, Mahrukh, which probably a lot of people don't know. The Gen Z, the youngsters these days, for them, and I'm not talking about Pakistan or South Asia or Asia, I'm talking about the whole world when you talk to the youngsters.
Yeah.
Two countries which are deeply hated now are India and Israel. And I'm talking about Europeans, Americans, South Americans, East Asians, South Asians, everywhere in the world. And India has become a laughing stock of the world, I'll tell you, on the internet servers everywhere. Now people actually, Indians are not even sort of, they're pretending not to be Indians now because there's so much criticism. I mean, the Modi's whole persona, Modi's whole sort of, whatever he stands for, it is all, I think it is all faulted now, So basically, he has to reinvent or he has to go now, basically. And I think it would be very hard to see how he can reinvent, how he can rejuvenate from here, how he can sort of, like a phoenix, he could rise from the ashes here, because politically, I think he's done now.
In terms of the erosion of their diplomacy, do you feel that it's been gradual under Modi? Because of course, it started with the exposure of what's happening within India and what was being painted, the facade crumbling, whether we look at Kashmir and what, was being said and actually what was happening. And then it, of course, moves on to Palestine and the way that, the silence over it, which has now become a growing concern within India itself also and outside, whatever people, their own intelligentsia, like I said, their media, there is deep concern for what the state is going through.
Exactly.
So and the erosion of the US, however we look at it, with US-India relationship.
I mean, that relationship is so many cracks now. You see, we have to remember that, Nehruvian India, which stood for anti-imperialism. And today's India, which is with the sort of, imperialistic Israel, and it's with sort of, everything that imperialism stood for. What a contrast it is. This is the India, okay, they touted the Gandhian philosophy of nonviolence. Now we see an India which totally relies on violence, whether it's inside the country or outside. And that violence has failed. It has failed in Kashmir. It is failing in Ladakh, as which is part of Jammu and Kashmir, disputed territory, of course. It is failing in the Seven Sisters state in India. It is failing in South India, everywhere. And it's failing outside India as well. Their attempt to sort of, blackmail Pakistan into submission. They're using their military might. Their 10 times bigger budget has failed miserably, In fact, the befitting response.
The delusions of grandeur, I think.
Those delusions of grandeur that Modi had, and look at his persona. There's somebody who's not even properly educated. There's somebody who can't even speak properly, is not even coherent most of the times. He was built into some sort of a messiah. And because this was a very false narrative, so eventually it has just the whole thing is shattered before the world's eyes. And I think it is India's loss, because in India there are good people too. It's not that they're there are people who understand that their country is going in a wrong direction.
Their own opposition leader is really, calling out when we look at what Rahul Gandhi is saying. He's pointing out the discrepancy, he's pointing out the grave mistakes that have been made. And I think that is glaringly obvious what is being. Thank you so much, Juauhar Saleem Sahab. Thank you for your very valuable time. I'm going to move on to Munir Akram, who's just joined us, of course, the former permanent rep for Pakistan to the UN. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Akram, we're talking about the complete erosion of the kind of, humanity that as far as the stance by India on Palestine is concerned. Among many things that have been said, we know what Rahul Gandhi is saying, of course, morally bankrupt, betrayal of India's tradition of human rights, whether it's Shashi Tharoor, who's talking about politicization of the foreign policy in India. How are you looking at these developments? And of course, and the fact that they expose India in the light that the world has to now acknowledge what's happening across the border.
India's wrong direction, as you put it, has been underway at least since 2015, with the advent of the BJP RSS government in New Delhi. This is a regime that is driven by ideology of supremacy and an ideology of hate against Muslims and other religions. It is an extremist regime, and that extremism has been manifest over these past decade that they have been in power. It is, of course, only now that the true nature of this regime is becoming visible to the world. It was quite visible to us in Pakistan. It was quite visible to the Kashmiris and to the Muslims of India as to what is the nature of this regime. But it is now becoming visible to the world. This is a regime of based on Hindu supremacism, arrogance, and aggressiveness towards all external influences and all external entities. So this is becoming visible, and I think that's a good thing.
I want to whatever's the stance that we've seen as far as India is concerned, of course Modi's stance on Israel, there's been accusations that Modi is prioritizing his own personal relationship with Netanyahu over humanitarian concerns. And when we talk about global voices, we know that what Amnesty International has said by calling it India's responsibility to speak against genocide, which is not happening. Whether we talk about The Guardian, which is talking about a political miscalculation that is harming its global reputation. So there is an all-out, and that is not just restricted, of course, internationally, but even domestically. There is huge concern over the way that India has the lack of response as far on the genocide in Palestine. How are you looking at this particularly?
You see, India has had bet on its alliance with the United States, and as a subsidiary of that alliance, its alliance with Israel. This was the configuration that they had in mind. What has happened is that India's alliance with the United States has come into question for a variety of reasons: trade, personal friction with President Trump, the effort to assert that India is strategically autonomous from the United States, something that the US does not accept. So its erosion of its alliance with the United States has left it isolated in its alliance with Israel. And that is what is being exposed. And of course, the Western media saying that India should defend human rights. When has India defended human rights? The Western press is now suddenly woken up to the fact that India has been violating human rights in Kashmir. It is no surprise to me that they are not siding or they are not upholding international law in Gaza, because they've been violating international law in Kashmir for decades. So the Western media, of course, has just woken up to the fact because they realize that their own governments are under pressure to condemn the genocide in Gaza. India is a serial violator of human rights. It is an aggressive state. It has intervened. It has promoted terrorism in its whole neighborhood. So I'm not surprised at Modi's lack of empathy with the genocide in Gaza.
But do you think that, whether lack of course, we've known for a while that this is a complete lack of empathy, whether the Western media calls it selective empathy or whatever, like you said. The question is, it is also an all-round failure of diplomatic relations. And, of course, this is an India that talked about Pakistan being on FATF. This is an India that said that Pakistan is a terrorist state. This is an India that said that Pakistan is going to be isolated. So is it also in India, in your opinion, that is, probably because of its own hubris or because of its own, like I said, illusions of grandeur, has suffered, thinking that it is the US or that it is China of the region? Is that also responsible for the kind of miscalculations that we've seen?
Absolutely. You see, this is a regime which has made itself believe in its own propaganda, that we are a great power, that the world is coming to us and the world seeks partnership with India. India has a big market. Everybody has to listen to us. And we, India, as a great power, big country, biggest country in the world, and that we have the ability to have strategic autonomy. And we, of course, we want partnership with the US, but we are free to also have relations with Russia and anybody else we want. That has been exposed now for several reasons. One, it has been exposed in the military conflict with Pakistan, where India was defeated in this short conflict by a power which is 1/7 the size of India. So it was exposed that it is not a great power. Then it made further diplomatic mistakes by denying a role for Trump in the ceasefire, and that annoyed the United States. On top of the arrogance that the Indians had in the trade negotiations with the United States, which also had raised questions about the nature of the partnership between the US and India. So they made a number of mistakes and compounded their mistakes with their lies. And I think that has combined to erode the relationship with the US, and that is the fundamental foundation of their strategy, which has collapsed.
I want to, Mr. Akram, I want to move on to, Ladakh also and the situation that has been brewing there. We know that, the deadly crackdown on peaceful statehood protesters that's happened. Do you think that's also an extension of the kind of extremism and the kind of suppression that has consistently happened under the Modi regime?
Yes, of course, you remember that when Modi abrogated the statehood of Jammu and Kashmir, occupied Jammu and Kashmir, they separated Ladakh from that. And they made it into so-called union territory. The Ladakhis were not consulted, and they were not happy to be placed under a union rule or direct rule from New Delhi. And plus, they annoyed the Chinese because they have a disputed border in Ladakh with China that has been a bone of contention and has seen this clash in 2022. So I think India has sort of portrayed the situation in Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh in a very different way. They say their normalization has happened. It hasn't happened. The people of Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh are unhappy with Indian occupation. And that is something that the Modi government has exacerbated because of its heavy-handed rule in Ladakh. And the protests are a sign of the rejection of this heavy-handed rule by the people of the region.
How deep do you think that, the disconnect between the foreign policy and domestic governance is at this time? Because of course, the way that these protests have erupted, the issue of course is a long-standing one. It's also an ignored one as far as India is concerned under the Modi leadership.
Yes, of course. India will have to solve the problem it faces in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and of which Ladakh is a part. It'll have to find that solution with the consent of the people of the state, and it will have to find a solution in consultation with Pakistan. It is not prepared to do so. And so long as it denies the possibility of negotiating a solution, it will continue its occupation. It's got 900,000 troops in Jammu and Kashmir, and it is engaged in a campaign of suppression. It's a major problem for India, which it does not admit. And this is the crux of the issue. And obviously, its foreign policy towards Pakistan, towards China, will continue to be at odds if it does not realize the real nature of the problem that they are facing in Jammu and Kashmir.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Munir Akram. Thank you for your very valuable time. We'll be taking a short break, after which we'll come back and talk about the situation that is brewing in Ladakh and, what are the alternatives, what are the options available for a deeply crumbling state like India. Please stay with us. Welcome back. We have with us Brigadier Retired Waqar Khan, who's a security analyst. Thank you so much for being with us. Brigadier Sahab, the situation at this time in Ladakh, do you think that, it is of course a deeply troubled state. It's also a crumbling state in terms of its diplomatic relationships all around. Under the Modi leadership, it is something that is being said domestically, it is something that is being said internationally also, whether it's the Palestine issue or it's, what's happened internally, what's happening domestically, and in Ladakh also. In terms of, we were just speaking to Munir Akram Sahib, and he talked about how India is perhaps at that juncture now where they will have to take into account the wishes of the people when we look at the Kashmiri people, and of course, by extension, what's happened in Ladakh also, and the public in Ladakh.
I think Ladakh was a very clever ploy by Modi government to basically undermine the occupied Jammu and Kashmir. State was very big. If you look at the area, and I have the figures, like Ladakh is just a population of 275,000. It's just like a small town, and an area of about 56,000 square kilometer or 59,000 square kilometer. Whereas the occupied Jammu and Kashmir, what is left now, is having a population of about 12 million. So I think this was one to undermine the, let's say, only so-called Muslim majority state, cut off the area, and then probably they thought that since the Buddhist population is passive, they'll be able to then change demographically and then bring in that grand design of India. Now that is failed miserably because Ladakh is very very sensitive. Occupied Ladakh is surrounded by actually two countries. It is China towards the north and northeast, and Pakistan towards northwest. And it is actually wedged between that. India also lost almost 4,500 square kilometers in 2020. And Mr. Sonam Wangchuk, who is now leading the, you can say, the agitation, he's the one who raised this voice that China is absorbing territory and Indian military is doing nothing. And now I think they started asking for statehood, assembly, seats, etc. And there's also an undercurrent that India would try to bring in, let's say the Hindu population and then change the demographic, which is a very, very serious issue. Now I think Sonam Wangchuk, although he was on a fast, but Gen Z from Ladakh came out. They burned down BJP's office. It was almost something like very close to what happened in Nepal. And India had to then cut a sorry figure in front of international community. But now he has been arrested. He is a very peaceful activist, and he has been arrested with charges of having links with Pakistani intelligence. It's always very funny to look at Indian governors and their the way they operate with a pack of lies. So although it's a very very serious situation, there is also agitation picking up in occupied Kashmir because of arrest of Mr. Malik, one of the MPs, and you may find something like that happening in that part also. Indian Punjab is in serious trouble. It's almost like Rwanda. Sikhs and Punjabis are, throwing out the Urdu-speaking people from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. It's become a very, very serious issue. Then you have Manipur, you have South India. So all three corners of India are burning. And I don't know
this is a deeply
how long
troubled
Mr.
state.
would.
So India is, of course, a deeply troubled state at this time. In terms of exposing itself, for a while we know what's happened as far as Kashmir is concerned, and the way that it has tried to elude the world, the facade that has been painted, the no news could have gone out from Indian occupied Kashmir, the way that we saw the media ban. And what's exposed, the exposure in Ladakh itself is also, like you said, it's an extension of what's happened. The suppression that happened in Kashmir that now extended within India also, what's happened in Ladakh also. Do you think that acknowledgement within, whether we look at the opposition parties also within India, there is a growing acknowledgement of the failure of foreign policy? That is leading to this kind of a catastrophe?
Yeah, I think it has been a failure internally and externally. If you look at the internal oppression by BJP and RSS, it has been phenomenal. But now I think Rahul Gandhi has given some hope. If you look at Bihar elections, it's going to be a very, very, I would say, litmus test how the both sides are going to basically contest. And there are chances that maybe Modi gets defeated. And then there are calls, that enough is enough. Minorities, Adivasis, other, groups like Christians, Sikhs, everybody's fed up. And actually, I foresee that in case BJP continues with this policy, there could be a civil war-like situation. And India is a huge country. I mean, it's one Arab and 40 crore people. But I think the powder keg has already exploded in Manipur. In the northeast, they are having serious problems. Then you have northwest, Ladakh, and Indian Punjab. And I think even Kashmir, occupied Kashmir could actually explode anytime because people are actually fed up with this oppressive policy, changes in demographics. And now every state appears to be, appears to be a country in India. Like if you look at Punjab and Haryana, they don't want any Urdu-speaking people to come and work because there's a threat of demographic change. So I think Modi has failed on all fronts. Internationally, they are highly isolated. If you look at how US is treating them, how Middle East is now siding with Pakistan through defense agreement, China, even the SCO, I think, understands Pakistan policy, and Pakistan is doing very well. And if you look at India's closer neighborhood, everybody is, I would say, annoyed or fed up. Sri Lanka,
Even
Bangladesh, Nepal.
domestically, and even domestically there is rising concern over Modi's policies that are breeding in the Hindutva and extremism. Thank you so much, Brigadier Saab. On that note, of course, lastly, we'll also like to end by India and Pakistan's Asia Cup final that's expected tomorrow, and the politicization of a game like cricket that we see at the hands of India. Of course, we look at the start of it happening by the Indian captain on the field, and we see it transcending into, of course, the undue influence of Jeshe, son of Amit Shah, and the result that seems to be BJP controlling the ICC. And of course, questions rising about whether it is the Indian Cricket Council or the International Cricket Council. This is what's happening at the hands of a country like India to a game much respected and globally paid. On that note, thank you so much for joining us today on Perspective.